So, maps are made to be looked at, charts are made to be worked on. I've always had a predilection for charts, which means that they're ultimately rarer because they get worked on and used up, but they're not necessarily more valuable. And the history of cartography is largely driven by value. So, this is an image of Chesapeake Bay from 1759. With reference to the bay, it is a map because it presents no useful information about Chesapeake Bay, but it's got data about the topography and the road system and the settlements on the land. So it's a map. This is very different. This is a chart printed in 4 sheets, shifted clockwise so that north is to the right. It was printed in July of 1776, and it involved, at the very least, the participation of 3 major experts, Robert Sayer and John Bennett, master cartographers and publishers in London, and Anthony Smith, who was a master pilot of all the tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay. They were very prolific publishers. In that same year of 1776, Sayer and Bennett published this chart of Delaware Bay, and you'll note in the cartouche in the upper left the names of 23 specific shipmasters and their 23 pilots who all endorsed this chart enough that they actually paid a subscription for its publication. So again, this is in the world of working people and charts. At the same time, also in 1776, Sayers and Bennett published this handy pocket atlas to the battles of the American Revolution, which began the year before in 1775. So you could not only, through Sayers and Bennett, you could follow the progress of the war, but you could participate in the war through their cartography. This is windowing into the entrance of Chesapeake Bay, Cape Henry to the south, Cape Charles to the north, because again, the north is to the right, and then the beginnings of the lower part of Chesapeake Bay and the James and York rivers, very important in what was to follow in the American Revolution. Early on, just as you come in, Sayers and Bennett and Anthony Smith introduce the thwart mark. The thwart mark was fundamental to everything about the cartography of this chart. You can see a line, a magnetic west line going through the windmill that's there above Point Comfort. If you were on a ship on a magnetic west bearing pointed at the windmill, and you came up to where a line from the westernmost sandhill crossed that line, then you were at a junction of great significance. If you stayed outside that thwart mark, you wouldn't go aground on the shoal. So, thwart comes from Old Norse, which is to say that we're talking about Viking geography here. And thwart survives in the English language in several contexts. In nautical stuff, which remains very conservative, thwart is a noun. The wooden cross pieces of a canoe are thwarts. It also survives as a verb. The Republicans' plan to appeal Obamacare was thwarted. That's what thwarting means. You cross it. You put something in an obstacle in its path. That particular primordial thwart mark was explained on this chart as to how to deal with the horseshoe and the westernmost sandhill and all that stuff. It also, like all maps and charts, is a political document because it represents the fact that on New Year's Day of that fateful year of 1776, the British burned Norfolk to the ground. This is the area between York and Gloucester on the York River. This is where the final battles on land of the American Revolution came down. There were also maritime battles out at the entrance of Chesapeake Bay. You can see all the thwart marks. There's a whole typology of them. It's standardized. There's a single dashed line, there's a thin solid line, there's a thick solid line, there's a double line that you don't see in this particular section. I have no idea what those thwart marks and the differentiation between them represents, but it was really standard throughout the map. So clearly there was either an accompanying publication or there was verbal instruction that went, some sort of knowledge system that accompanied the thwart marks. Nevertheless, I submit that this particular map of Anthony Smith and Sayers and Bennett was one of the most important maps in American history, although it is rarely known. That is because this map in all its versions was absolutely fundamental to the end of the Revolutionary War. It was published in London originally in 1776. By 1778, there were two pirated editions in Paris. The first was done by a commercial publisher. The second was done by the Dépôt Général des Cartes, basically the French Navy. That meant that in 1881, when the final battles came down at Yorktown and out at Chesapeake Bay, all forces, British, American, French, were using this map. This map was absolutely fundamental to the successful resolution of the American Revolution. The French, in their edition, didn't have any of the thwart marks on it because they didn't know what they meant. So they were useless to them. At the same time, they didn't neglect to show the ruins of Norfolk brûlées in 1776. So, the successful revolution of the United States had many implications. Amongst them were, it delayed by many decades the successive stages of the end of slavery, which ended much earlier in the British Empire. A major salvo in the beginning of the final part of that was the very first of the Coast Survey's slavery maps. The next one that they did after this was the slavery map for all of the counties of where slavery was legal in the South in 1861. The story in brief is this. The 1860 census data was explosive because it showed that apart from the Southerners' rhetoric that don't worry about slavery, it's going away, actually slavery was expanding rapidly in Louisiana and Texas. The Southern Democrats, still in the Union at that time, before secession, defunded the Census Bureau from publishing their data. The Census Bureau got their data secretly to the Coast Survey. The first trial run of mapping the basic data of the census in 1861 was this, the slavery map of Virginia. And if you look specifically, data was initially aggregated on the county level. That Norfolk County, only about little more than 1 out of every 4 humans in the county was a slave. But if you look at the region in general, most humans in this region were enslaved. And the graphic patterns are, just quite distinct. And as Abraham Lincoln said, then the war came. So yet another map of Virginia. The Coast Survey brought in W.L. Nicholson, who was the master. He was the master of chromolithography, doing lithography in multiple colors, which means he was a master of registration. And he jump-started the lithography program of the Coast Survey. This is a revised version of his very first map, which became a bestseller, the map of Virginia, first published in 1862. I'm using the revised 1864 edition of the map for a certain reason. If we look close into things, you can see the level of detail, road systems. We've been hearing a lot about roads in the Civil War that was on these maps, that the Coast Survey did from original work and also compilation from a variety of sources. India red was reserved exclusively for railroads, which were so fundamentally important in the progress of the war and strategy about it. You can, well, all right, the other thing they had, you can see concentric rings 10 miles out in succession. So you could track the distance of Union and Confederate armies from Richmond that way. This is the painting by Francis Carpenter that's in the Senate wing of the Capitol. There are two maps visible in this painting of Abraham Lincoln preparing to read the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet for the very first time. This was painted in 1864. You can see a bit of the full Coast Survey slavery map propped up on the lower right, and the Virginia map flopped over the table there by the cabinet secretary. That's how important this particular cartography was in terms of the prosecution of the war. Then the war was over and life went on in the late 19th century. In 1881, the Coast and Geodetic Survey did this very interesting map as a commemoration of the centennial of the completion of the American Revolution with the battles of Yorktown Peninsula. And it's a really strange map. The topography was done in the Civil War by the Union Army and the Coast Survey, but not updated. The hydrography was contemporary Coast and Geodetic Survey cartography. So in the case of Norfolk, they're showing Norfolk as it was in colonial times, Norfolk brûlé. Incongruously, all the aids to navigation were accurate to 1881. In 1889, only 8 years later, they did this more normal version of the chart of Norfolk and environs. And you can see the way that this whole area, Hampton Roads, Newport News, Portsmouth, Norfolk, etc., is now considered the largest naval base in the world. It sprawls over many counties. In 1903, the Coast and Geodetic Survey did this chart that I think is a worthy successor to the work of Sayers and Bennett of Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay in the previous century. It's pretty interesting. The only detail on the topography of the land, apart from the cities, is the network of railroads and the way they connect to ports. So this is a map of commercial and shipping infrastructure. And if we look specifically at, again, Norfolk in context, you can see how that nexus between shipping and the Navy and railroads was important enough that the only place on the map where the topography pushes back beyond the neat lines was down here, so you could see the nexus between Suffolk and Norfolk, right there. Then into the 20th century, all kinds of modes of transportation changed at a rapid rate. This is a commercial map from 1930 showing a world that is hard for us to even conceive of now. Before there were major bridges over most of Chesapeake Bay, and there were these armies of ferry boats that carried people and cargoes about. You can see there's a road system that's there, but it is emphasized on one level in 1930. By 1935, that road system is emphasized in a way larger and more prominent way because automotive traffic and trucks are taking over, bridges are coming in, the ferries are disappearing. In 1935, this is the first edition, the first generation of the Coast and Geodetic Survey's aeronautical chart for part of the Chesapeake Bay region. Coast Survey got the responsibility for civilian aviation charts in 1925. They had been doing nautical charts since the 19th century, so they started calling these aeronautical charts, and the term stuck, and that's what they're called. The ethereal pink beam there is a depiction of the first generation directional radio beams from the airport in Richmond, Virginia, which was the first to have them. So all kinds of work continued in and around and about Chesapeake Bay, including the continuing work of discriminating against African Americans. This is from the marvelous project at the University of Richmond, Mapping Inequality, where they're revisiting in a digital humanities context the redlining maps that were done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation of the federal government in the late 1930s. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into why it is that there's not a single red line on a redlining map, but the first map up there above is Newport News, and then the map in the rectangle there is Newport, or is rather Norfolk. If we look into it, the redlining maps dealt exclusively with largely or completely residential neighborhoods. So the white areas are either mixed use or downtown or golf courses or parks or cemeteries or whatever. And the typology for coding residential areas was green, blue, yellow, red, best, still desirable, definitely declining, and red, hazardous. So red, hazardous had nothing to do with personal safety of people who lived in that neighborhood. It was hazardous to bankers and mortgage company executives, and it indicated the areas that the federal government was actively requesting or suggesting that mortgages not be underwritten in, which is to say the black and poor neighborhoods. So this is the deliberate propagation of segregation and discrimination cartographically. And if for the context of this is, the hotel we're at is right there in the modern Google map. So you can see that most of Norfolk and Portsmouth were dangerous and declining in the eyes of the federal government at that time. And then another war came. This is a section of the Coast and Geodetic Survey's chart for basically a major part is what is now the world's largest naval base. In the edition of 1943, and you can see that after Pearl Harbor in 1942, they did an emergency dredging of the channel, the major channel, so that the largest ships then extant in the US Navy and the anticipated even larger ships could make it going and coming from the naval yard. And then we come to now, at the end of that war, the modern era and a whole set of modern issues. And particularly the thing that dominates and should dominate our lives now is the major nature of climate change. And in the case of Norfolk, like sea level rise, etc. And a confounding thing is it is so very difficult cartographically to suggest this appropriately. And to that end, Norfolk is unique in American history right now in that the relative rise of mean sea level in Norfolk is the greatest of anywhere in the United States. The basic metric is that sea level has risen 45 centimeters in about the last century. Why they say about the last century is that for Norfolk and a whole lot of other places, in the modern context of geodesy, reality begins with the Coast and Geodetic Survey's sea level datum of 1929. And sea level is only local. And so if with this marvelous Mexican Taylor's ruler, this was sea level back about a century ago. This is mean sea level of Norfolk now. It looks like a trivial distance. It's not at all. One of the greatest challenges of modern cartography is to somehow convey the nature of and dramatic scope and implications of this change. I mean, you look at this, if you're Donald Trump, you go, hey, I got a hot tub that's deeperly than that, right? This is a big thing. Norfolk and environs are, there's land, there's water, there's land, there's water. There's a lot of tidal datums. When you do various stuff on the National Geodetic Survey site, the one that generally comes up first is at Sewell's Point, which is over across on Hampton Roads. And so there's a particular site there, there's a particular level. You can evaluate where the sea is going up or down, tide going in, tide going out, relative to that site. Now, of those 45 centimeters rise in the last century, about 20 centimeters is the guesstimate for the last century's melted glacier ice that's turned into water volume spread across the world ocean, and also thermal expansion of the water because it's warmer. The rest of the 25 centimeters is in part because with climate change, the Gulf Stream is now closer to the Atlantic coast, which pushes water towards the shore. Also the fact that profound groundwater pumping under Norfolk, like everywhere else in the United States, has caused a certain amount of dropping down to the ground level. But the other thing that's unique to Norfolk and environs is that 35 million years ago, a small asteroid called a shiny bolide just landed right there. It was 35 million years ago, and how they know it was shiny is beyond me. But the implications of that are that Norfolk, Hampton Roads, the largest naval base in the world, is part of a set of terrains which is now, and has been for 35 years, slowly sinking into the impact crater. So the 45 centimeters of Norfolk is partly that the sea level is going up, but also that the land level is going down. This, by the way, is in the very long tradition of geological mapping of truly unfortunate decisions in color assignment. It does get worse. So how to deal with all this stuff? This is approximately about a century ago what the terrain looked like, all the extensive land that wasn't developed. This is how it looks now. So on top of everything else, massive development of Norfolk and environs has really, it's way more than just the sea level is higher than it was. What is the solution? The repurposing and rediscovery of thwart marks. Because this landscape is land, water, land, water. The human tendency to see alignments, to see lines that aren't actually there, and then make judgments about going on this side of the line or the other. So I'm bringing this back from 2 centuries ago as my potential suggestion about what Norfolk and environs can do about rising sea level, in part because they don't have a whole lot of other options. Thank you. Until last year, I was a historian, a NOAA historian of the Coast Survey. And so I did, the best thing I did was I scanned about 8,000 maps in national. Well, I can talk to you later about it, but all the maps that I scanned in 2007 and 2008 are on a NOAA website, although along with 20,000 maps of more questionable quality. So it's hard to find them. But some other maps are from the Library of Congress. I mean, just in general, there's lots and lots of cartography that is now digitally available. I must say, though, that it's a shame that the Coast Survey's incredible Civil War cartography is not more broadly known than it is, because they were very good, as you saw in that thing.